Well, after a weekend of eating, the subject of food might not be real popular. It might seem a little misdirected. But we're going to talk about hunger this morning. I thought it fit to address a different kind of hunger or a lack of hunger. We're talking about spiritual hunger, the hunger for God. And I do this because we are in the midst of a season of national obsession and consumption right now. From now on until the first of the year, there's going to be so many parties. You're going to be buying so much stuff. And it seems like we might have an opening here where we are frustrated with trying to fulfill our own inner needs, our soul desires. You know, although Christmas is a wonderful time of year, it's possible for your soul to get very hard, very callous this time of year, just because of the busyness and the consumption. Hunger is a common metaphor in the Bible. Remember, the story begins with God providing everything in the garden, all the fruit that they want to eat, right? There's just one that they can't eat, and that's the one that they want. And hunger is this metaphor throughout Scripture, throughout the story. The subject of hunger and food is often used to show God's provision. Remember, the promised land was a place flowing with milk and honey. And God says, oh, there's huge grapes there, there's pomegranates, there's everything that you might want to eat. That is often the metaphor. And we might have difficulty talking about hunger because reality is that most of us have probably never really been hungry. You may not have what you want to eat in the refrigerator, but you've probably never really gone days without food. Being in a developed country, I've never gone a day without eating food on my own, unless I wanted to during a fast. But for most of the world, hunger or famine is a very real issue. Famines still happen in much of the world. Still the number one health risk. Kills more people than AIDS, malaria, TB combined. Some 925 million people do not have enough to eat today. 1 in 7 will go to bed hungry. So in the developing world, in the non-Western world, which is 2/3 of the world's population, by the way, hunger is a very real issue. But we have to kind of use our imaginations to imagine what it would be like to really be hunger. And for those of you that take Bible interpretation seriously, this is a major obstacle and concerning the Western culture's challenge of interpreting the Bible, because things like this, like hunger, don't shake us. We don't really relate to this in the way that the rest of the world does. Now, probably the best known verse of Jesus about hunger is from the Beatitudes or the Be Happy Attitudes, Matthew 5:6, which is our core scripture for today, says, "Happy are people who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness, because they will be fed until they are full." Now, I want you to remember that passage today, so if you excuse me a little bit, let's chew on it and let's see if we can digest it, right? First of all, we're born hungry, aren't we? Well, hopefully you're born hungry, because if you're not, you're going to die soon. Everybody has to be hungry. If we lose our hunger for food, we can't survive. But the hunger that we're speaking of is the hunger of the soul, the hunger of our hearts for God. And that hunger comes from God. We are made in His image, and with that, God implants upon us this desire, this need for Him. It's in every human being, whether they're religious or not. God has imprinted us with this God desire. And whether we pursue the one living God or whether we substitute that with other lesser gods, it's still there. We know there's more. Even in the most secular person who denies the existence of God, still that person has a dissatisfaction with life that she or he tries to fill with other things. Strange thing about this is that we don't know how hungry we are until that hunger's met. I mean, we live every day, the non-Christian lives every day thinking, I'm being satisfied. These things are working for me. And God comes to us as a big surprise. I remember the first day that I realized that there was a God. I was shocked. I didn't realize how empty my life had been up until that day. Then all of a sudden I realized I was a mess. I didn't even know that I was a mess. And we read in our call to worship today, a short verse I want to revisit again from Psalm 34, verse 8. The psalmist says, "Taste and see how good the Lord is. The one who takes refuge in him is truly happy." I love that line. Taste and see. Again, that metaphor of eating. And if you take refuge in him, if you hide your life in him, you're going to be truly happy. St. Augustine, in his Confessions, his most often quoted statement, said, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our heart is restless until it rests in you." And we say, yeah, that's it. You know, I've got this restlessness about me until I find the Lord. I was restless and I didn't even know that I was restless. Until I found him, then I realized, my gosh, how did you make it all those years? There was, as so many people say, a God-shaped hole in us that was made for God and could be filled only by God. We're all born spiritually hungry. We have a desire, even if we don't know that it's for the Lord. Before we can be blessed, though, Jesus says that we need to be hungry. We need to become aware of the gnawing desire that burns within us. Jesus says that we must be starving for righteousness. Righteousness means, righteousness can mean a lot of different things the way it's used in Scripture, but here, righteousness means walking in God's perfect will. So, we can be starving for that. Happy are those who hunger. And I think about this in a world where starvation was just a daily problem and worried about the next meal. Hunger must have seemed kind of an unlikely path when Jesus first said this. The fact, Jesus makes it clear that he's talking about a hunger for righteousness. Hardly clarifies things. It seems like he puts the emphasis in the wrong place. I mean, shouldn't he have said, "Blessed are those who get righteousness"? Doesn't hunger for righteousness imply a lack of righteousness? And I think, where's the blessing in that? But Jesus begins with hunger. And right away we see that Jesus is talking about a realm where the order of things is very different than what we're used to. In our thinking about righteousness, we would rather dwell on what we lack, on what we have, than what we lack. And Jesus says where his kingdom is concerned, it's better to come empty than it is to come full, and for a very good reason. And Jesus knows that without hunger, you see, we will have very little interest in righteousness. And that's why the blessing of this beatitude is attached to hunger and thirst rather than to righteousness. Jesus is pointing to just a very fundamental misconception that we have. We think that righteousness is the condition we must be in order to be blessed. And Jesus says, no, it's hunger is the condition that you need to be in order to be blessed. But then he proposes something rather radical. Turns about our ideas about God and righteousness upside down. Jesus doesn't say righteousness is the condition for blessing. Jesus says righteousness is the blessing. Hunger is the precondition. If you truly hunger and thirst for righteousness, God will provide it. If you don't hunger and thirst for righteousness, you won't be interested in it. Even if Jesus gives us a written invitation, you still won't be interested. So God in his goodness paves the way for the blessing by sending us hunger. A hunger of the soul, naturally, to each one of us. And this is the problem that we face when it comes to spiritual hunger. Jesus says the blessing of righteousness comes only to those who hunger and thirst for it. But our natural state is denial. And Jesus says if you really want to be satisfied, you don't get there by saying, I'm doing okay, I'm doing pretty well. I think I'm doing fine. I know occasionally I have a few things that I do wrong and I have a few things that I fight against, but most of the time I'm doing pretty well. And having that kind of attitude, he says, is not how you're satisfied. Having the kind of attitude that says, I'm not doing okay, I'm hungry, I want more, is the only way to gain righteousness. And again, righteousness means walking in God's perfect will here. Now, not only do we need to be made aware of our hunger, to be blessed, but we need to accept our emptiness. It's not enough to just have the need. We need to know the full depth of the need. It's not socially acceptable to appear to be needy. Nobody wants to hang around other people that just are needy all the time. It makes us kind of uncomfortable, doesn't it? Even those who are in great need often hide their needs. We don't want to say, oh my, it's just things are just terrible. Somebody walks up to you and says, how's it going? You go, oh, it's nasty, it's terrible. My life's just a mess. You go, well, that's nice. Why don't you talk to him? See, it's just socially unacceptable. And we transfer the same self-deception to God in our walk with Him. We don't want to appear to be too needy. Whatever is average for the church, if everybody's going to be doing it, then we're going to be doing it with them, right? We don't want to appear to be too hungry, too needy. So if everybody's doing something that's Easter time or Christmas time, well, yeah, we'll do that with them. We'll read the book with them. We'll go to the Bible study with them or whatever, but we don't want to appear to be too needy. You know, everything's fine. I'm right here with the average. Yeah, I could eat a little bit more, but I'm not really that hungry. Things are pretty good. And with that kind of dumbed down conformity, I mean, we can literally starve to death spiritually. We need to be desperately hungry for God. We are to always be hungry, not just on Sundays or Easter or around Christmas. You know, probably one of the most controversial statements that Jesus ever said had to do with a dinner party that he once went to. He had just had a recent convert. His name was Matthew. He was a tax collector. In the Jewish culture, that meant that he was a thief and a traitor. He had sold out to the Romans. And he calls Matthew as one of his disciples, and Matthew throws a party of his friends. And of course, Matthew's friends were not the little boys and girls that went to Sunday school, but Matthew's friends were some pretty rough people. People like him, other tax collectors, ladies that hang around those kind of guys. And he throws a dinner party at his house. And Jesus goes to it, obviously, because they're people like anybody else. But while he's there, the Pharisees see it, and oh my, they get in quite a tizzy about that, because, you know, it's not right to eat with people like that. You'll get dirty, you see. You're supposed to be, they had this outward in idea of righteousness, that if you become righteous on the outside, look righteous, that it'll somehow seep into your heart. Jesus taught an inside-out version of righteousness. Righteousness in your heart then reflects in your life. But the Pharisees had it outward in. And so they go to his disciples and they say, you know, I don't know what your rabbi's doing. We thought he was okay, but here he is eating with these known sinners. You know, these tax collectors and these whores. What kind of a man would do that? So the Pharisees, they get it all in a wad, and they complain to disciples who told Jesus. And Jesus told them this, Matthew 9:12-13. When Jesus heard it, that is them complaining, he said, healthy people don't need a doctor, but sick people do. Well, obviously, that's a good illustration. He says, go and learn what this means. I want mercy, not sacrifice. I didn't come to call righteous people, but sinners. So he's saying, I didn't come to call the full people. I came to call the empty people, the people that are hungry. Same situation remains today. The Pharisees were sick. They just didn't know it. They were hungry. They were trying to satisfy their God hole with all these other things that were temporary. And Jesus was right there with him. And they weren't hungry at all for him. Years ago, I read a book, John Krakauer, Into Thin Air. Back in 1996, he told the story of the climbing of Mount Everest by a team of explorers, very advanced explorers. Nobody goes up Mount Everest unless you're at the top of your class. And there are a lot of deaths in 1996 on this summit expedition of Mount Everest. And one of them who died was a guy named Andy Harris. And he was one of the leaders. And he had been to some of the tallest mountains in the world. But he got on top of Everest and he made a critical mistake. And that was that he savored it just a little bit too long. And when you make the ascent to the summit on Everest, you get up very early in the middle of the night and you begin in the dark. And once you get, now this sounds ridiculous, they go for weeks trying to get to the summit. Once you get to the summit, you can only stay there a few minutes. Because if you stay there too long, you won't get back down. And Andy Harris just stood up there too long and looked and savored the moment. And everybody else left, and he was alone. And on the way back, he got in a very desperate situation. He began to run out of oxygen. And so he radioed back to base camp and told him, he says, I'm getting low of oxygen. And they said, well, there's a catch of oxygen tanks. And he says, I'm at that catch of oxygen tanks, but they're all empty. And they said, no, they're not, Andy. We were just there. They're all full. And he said, no, they're not. They're empty. He died right there. Because he was so low of oxygen that his brain was becoming distorted and he couldn't think. He could not get the help that he needed to get the oxygen that was right there. And I think about that in our world today. Jesus says you're very needy. You need so much more than what you know. And we say, no, we're doing fine. There's nothing wrong with me. And what's happened is that we live in a spiritually, live in a world that's full of spiritual poverty. And we just don't have the oxygen, so to speak, to know what our needs are. The problem for many of us is that we live in a malnourished environment. In fact, we're living in the midst of so much spiritual poverty that we have kind of a junk food diet spiritually. Your mother taught you this. We live in a junk food world. You don't eat cookies before your dinner. Why don't you get cookies before your dinner? Because it will spoil your appetite. Of course it will, and it does. You won't eat the good food. You won't eat the vegetables because you eat your cookies. And we know that with all of our children. Well, we're a junk food society. One study, a group of rats was fed a normal diet with limited access to junk food, and they gained some weight, but they didn't become obese. Another group of rats were given access to some junk food, and when as much junk food as they wanted, so soon they stopped eating the regular food and just kept eating more and more junk food. Then they introduced an electrical shock to the rats. They kept going after the junk food even though they were getting shocked electrically, and they became very obese. So they withdrew the junk food for 40 days from the rats. You know what they did? They didn't eat anything for 2 weeks. They almost died. Being withdrawn, still had their regular food there, but they would not eat that regular food because they wanted their junk food. Can you identify with that? I think I can identify with that. So they went after the junk food. And that's, kind of like being forced on a diet. So the researchers said, well, what's going on here? And they found that the special dopamine receptors in the little rats' brains, and we have them too, okay? Little dopamine receptors that say, oh, this is good, this feels good, this tastes good. That those receptors take more and more junk food, and they become dull. And so the rats just kept going back and eating more and more and still getting less of a buzz. And so it's now just pretty much accepted in the scientific community that junk food is addictive for some of us, in the same way that heroin and cocaine is addictive to some of us. We also know that processed foods makes our intestines lazy. Do you have a lazy intestine? I'm not going to go any deeper than that. But that's actually what happens. If you eat too much processed food or junk food, your intestines become incapable of really processing whole foods. And it takes a while. They say that people that come off junk foods and go to whole foods, kind of on a crash diet, don't feel any better for a while because they're not able to process the whole foods because their intestines have become so lazy. Okay? I don't think I could ever talk of my digestive system as being lazy, but perhaps it is. And I just thought about this and the similarity between how junk food is a substitute for real nutritious food, and yet we also substitute all kinds of other gods for the real gods in our lives. We try to satisfy our soul hunger with imitations. Isaiah 55, 1-2 says, all of you who are thirsty, come to the water. Well, this is 600 years before Jesus said that beatitude. All of you who are thirsty, come to the water. Whoever has no money, come, buy food and eat, without money at no cost buy wine and milk. Why spend money for what isn't food and your earnings for what doesn't satisfy? Listen carefully to me and eat what is good. Enjoy the richest of feasts. No, Isaiah the prophet says the same thing. Why are you buying stuff that doesn't satisfy you? You see? And it's all used as a metaphor for trying to satisfy these needs in our life. Want to satisfy the hunger of your soul with things that can't do it? Church sometimes doesn't help. Actually hurts. Sometimes we give people kind of sweet substitutes for God. I mean, we really do. We tell them that if you'll learn the Christian lingo, if you'll listen to the right music, if you'll learn the company stand on things, and sometimes we talk kind of in Christianese, as I would say. We've got these little pat answers for things. If you will abstain from close relationships to anybody that isn't a Christian, okay? If you'll do all that, then, you'll be satisfied. We tell them that if they trust God, that they will never, ever suffer. Your life's just going to be pure bliss if you will just trust God. And I think sometimes the church kind of dispenses junk food to people. We try to satisfy that hunger, and it doesn't do it. Maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours. But sooner or later, life catches up with you. And you realize that I've not been digesting anything. I've not been taking anything in that's of substance. It's just junk food, a cheap imitation, and it's addictive, and it reduces our capacity to personally seek the living God. Now, obviously I may do the same thing to you guys sometime, and we do it to each other. But we need to be aware that there's more to this than just putting a smile on our face and pretending that everything's going to be okay. We have to look to God to fill our emptiness. Why are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness blessed? It's just because they will be full. The promise underscores important aspects, I think, of righteousness that Jesus talks about here. He says, righteousness, first of all, righteousness is a gift. It's not a practice. You don't practice righteousness. You can't buy it. That having this position in your heart where you walk after the will of God. Who are the ones who are offered the promise of righteousness? Those who are empty. You have to first be empty. You have to get to the point where you realize your emptiness. Righteousness comes only one way. You can't work for it. You can't buy it. You wouldn't be able to afford it if you could buy it. You can't purchase this. The only way you can obtain righteousness is to receive it. And the only way you can receive righteousness is to get hungry enough for God to put it in you. And sometimes we have to come to that point in our lives where we get that hunger enough to allow God to do something in us. So the question is, how hungry are you? Are you just a nibbler? Are you just a taster when it comes to God? Are you ready to just starve? Are you starved for God? The question is, what if I'm not hungry right now? There are times when I desire God earnestly and I'm hungry, and there's other times when I don't. You know what I mean, don't you? Do you go through dry spells where you just really don't care? It's got nothing to do with the preacher. It's got nothing to do with the church. It may have nothing to do with your life. You go through times where you're just kind of preoccupied with so many other things that you just really don't care. Comes times where I don't really want to be satisfied. But it's all dependent upon my hunger. I don't always have the hunger. Think of Jesus, Jesus was hungry. He lived a very, very hungry life. When he started his ministry, the first thing that he did was he went out into the wilderness where he fasted, it says, for 40 days. No food. At the end of the 40 days, when he was hungry, it says, then the tempter, Satan, came to him. And you know what the first thing he tempted him with? Was food. He said, you're hungry? Why don't you make some stones into bread and eat the bread? Jesus said to him, Matthew 4:4, he says, "It is written, people won't live only by bread, but by every word spoken by God." Every word spoken by God. And I wonder, that still applies today. Do we hear that? No substitutes. Nothing but God can fill that hunger. Money can't, power can't, intelligence can't, sex can't, fame, popularity can't. And at the end of the lives of those who have eaten the junk food of this world, most people realize that there has to be more. If we want to be full of righteousness, full of God's perfect will, we'll have to want it, and we'll have to take the time to be hungry. It does take some time. You have to stop long enough to get hungry for God. Years ago, I had a man who had a pretty serious heart attack, a sudden one, and he thought he was going to die. Heart attacks, if you've ever known anybody that's gone through a heart attack, it's a very emotional thing in their life. It's a very spiritual thing. Something about having heart surgery is different than most other surgeries for men and women. And it was for him too. And he went through the surgery, and when he was done, I was sitting in his hospital room talking to him one day. And he said, we were talking about how he was just going on with his life, and he had been a good church man, but not really hungry for God. He was just doing what the average guy was doing in church. He was just, traveling along. And he looked at me and he says, Don, he said, God was there all the time, wasn't he? I said, yeah, he was. But he had to stop you long enough to get your attention, didn't he? He says, well, he's got my attention now. Heart attack's probably the best thing ever happened to him. God stopped him long enough for him to realize how really hungry he was in his life. To develop a good, deep hunger for God takes some time. It takes some prayer. It takes some drinking in the Word. It's not enough to listen to the radio station. You got to feast on the Word. You have to daily take in God's Word. You have to daily spend some time in prayer. And when you spend some time in prayer, what you find out at first is that we're a lot further apart than what I thought we were. Okay? If you're not doing this, I'm not talking about just praying for other people. I'm talking about really communing with God. You find out immediately that we're further apart than what I thought that we were further apart. See, I'm hungrier now. I was hungry all along, but now I realize how really hungry I am. We have to prepare a place for Him. We have to make room for Him. And just on a final thought here, in order for that to happen, we might have to detox. We might have to go cold turkey on some of this spiritual junk food that we've been taking into our lives, trying to satisfy ourselves. We might have to take an inventory of our lives and say, what do I run to when I'm needy? Where do I go when I'm feeling depleted? When I'm emotionally empty, what is it that I go to in order to try to satisfy this hunger that I have? We might have to detox. We might have to get rid of some of those things. God does the filling. We create the place. Is there room today? Do you have room in your life for God? Just sit and think about that for a minute.